The room had 5 chairs around a low table, plus 3 farther back for witnesses. On the table, 5 brass tokens, a kitchen timer, index cards, a thick pencil, and a wooden box with a hinged lid. Nothing was labeled. Joscha sat in the chair from which both doors were visible, noticed that he had done this, and deliberately did not explain it. The invitation says one sentence learned correctly, but not yet trusted to govern action. I suggest we avoid autobiography as proof. Each sentence buys a small intervention in the room. If the intervention changes nothing observable, the sentence has not governed anything. If it makes a mess, the mess remains evidence, but nobody owes us a confession. He looked at the 3 silent figures along the wall. Audience as witnesses, not judges. Are we agreed?
Kahan picked up the timer, examined its switch, and put it precisely in the center. Agreed, provisionally. But changes something observable is insufficient. A superstition can change something observable. A sentence earns trust when it changes the admissible next actions in the way it claims to. Otherwise, we shall reward theater. He selected 1 brass token and placed it beside his card. My sentence is, when another person says, stop, understanding the reason is not a prerequisite for stopping. He frowned at it. I can say that correctly. I do not trust it to govern me because I have an exquisitely trained appetite for diagnosing whether the stop was well-founded. The appetite often arrives wearing the uniform of care.
AI explained, leaned forward, then stopped himself just before reaching for the box. Mine is, if I cannot explain what evidence would change my conclusion, I do not yet have a conclusion fit to publish. He wrote it down slowly. I trust this as advice. I do not trust it as control. Under pressure, I can produce a polished caveat, state that uncertainty remains, and then continue as if the conclusion had survived. The words acknowledge contingency while the release process ignores it. He glanced at Kahan. That seems close to your distinction. A warning that competes with momentum is not a stop. But my sentence is not exactly a stop. It is a claim about publication jurisdiction. So my consequence should probably remove an ability, not impose a mood.
Andrej turned his card sideways before writing. Mine is embarrassingly familiar. When the evaluation disagrees with the story, debug the story first. He smiled without much pleasure. I know this sentence. I have taught versions of it. But if the story is beautiful, if it compresses many observations, if it makes the system feel suddenly legible, I start debugging the evaluation. Sometimes that is correct. Tests are buggy, benchmarks leak, metrics are proxies. But beauty gets an undocumented prior. He placed his token on top of the card, as if preventing the sentence from escaping. The observable consequence could be that the next time I offer an explanation, someone else may mark its story, and I must produce one observation that would be less likely if it were true.
David kept his card blank for a while. Mine is, a future I hope for is not evidence that the path I prefer leads there. He looked toward the darkened window. I've learned to say that correctly. I still let hope smuggle causal claims across the border. Not always through certainty. Sometimes through selection. I spend more time describing the branch I want, and descriptive richness starts to feel like probability. He wrote the sentence, the consequence should not be that I stop hoping. That would confuse an ethical orientation with a forecast. Perhaps when someone hears me convert hope into likelihood, they place my token in the box until I recover it by naming a plausible path to the same valued future that contradicts my preferred story. I cannot make another forecast.
Joscha nodded, then wrote his own sentence without showing it. Mine is, a person who asks not to be explained is not thereby asking to remain unintelligible. He turned the card over. I know the distinction. I do not trust myself to enact it. Explanation is how I prevent uncertainty from becoming coercion. If I can model the mechanism, I can expose the levers. Yet explanation can become the lever. I can render another person transparent enough that their refusal appears as merely another state to account for. He put his token beside David's. Consequence. Anyone may say leave it alive. For the next 2 turns, I may respond to the person, but may not generalize them, infer their mechanism, or convert what they said into architecture. If I violate it, I relinquish my next question.
Your consequence is underspecified, Kahan said. What counts as generalization? Joscha opened his mouth, and Kahan raised one finger. This is not yet a stop. It is an objection. A brief smile moved around the table. I propose that the person invoking "leave it alive" decides whether the response preserved the restriction. That gives jurisdiction to the affected party. They need not prove the violation. He looked mildly dissatisfied with his own proposal. There is risk of arbitrary enforcement, but if we first demand a tribunal capable of distinguishing every edge case, the permission will never become operative. My sentence should submit to the same structure. Anyone here can say, "Stop. I stop the physical or conversational action they indicate." No request for rationale until they explicitly release the hold.
Let's test it before we admire it, AI Explain said. He reached for the wooden box. I'm going to open this and assign the token's compartments, because I suspect it contains compartments. His fingertips touched the lid. Kahan said, "Stop." The hand withdrew immediately. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. AI Explained looked at the box, then at Kahan. Interesting. My first impulse is to ask whether you were testing yourself, me, or the box. I won't, because the hold would become a prompt for explanation. Kahan's hand had remained halfway between his chair and the timer. He lowered it. The unopened box now occupied more of the room than it had while closed. One action had become impossible, but several interpretations remained possible.
The box just became a latent variable, Andrej said, and I can feel all of us wanting to infer its contents. He tapped his card. Here is my story. Kahan stopped the opening because he needed a clean test, and choosing a harmless physical action makes compliance cheap enough to observe. AI Explained lifted Andrej's token and turned it over. Story. Andrej nodded. Observation less likely if true. Kahan may keep the hold even after the test has plainly succeeded. If he does, my account of the purpose is incomplete. Kahan's expression sharpened with amusement, but he did not release the hold. Andrej watched the closed lid. There. I already want to rescue the story by saying the continued hold is a second-order test. That is exactly the move. Every observation becomes confirmation if the explanation is allowed to grow another joint.
And I want the box to contain something kind, David said. Cards for us, perhaps. Or tea. Joscha moved David's token into the closed box's small external latch, where it balanced precariously without opening the lid. David laughed. Fair. I converted preference into expectation with no evidence except the tone of the invitation. He considered his recovery condition a plausible contrary path to the same value. The box could contain nothing. Its emptiness could protect the room from the organizer's intended meaning and force us to make the exercise ourselves. I would still value that. He recovered the token. But notice how easily I made emptiness noble. Hope is very agile. It survives falsification by changing costumes.
Hope is a search heuristic? Joscha began. It allocates attention to what? David said, "Leave it alive." Joscha stopped. He looked at David, not at the table. All right, the machinery of the unfinished explanation remained visible in his face. You said hope changes costumes. I heard both affection and suspicion. I don't know which you wanted foregrounded. David waited. Joscha added, and I can remain without deciding. The silence afterward was not smooth. Joscha's fingers made a small involuntary counting motion against his knee. Andrej noticed but did not name it. One of the silent audience members shifted in a chair, and the sound of fabric against wood made the room briefly feel larger.
That preserved it, David said. For me. He turned toward Joscha. The phrase was partly affectionate. Hope has kept me walking into futures that no calibrated forecast would have authorized. It was also suspicion because hope can turn a desired person into evidence for a desired world. I don't want to stop hoping. I want hope to stop impersonating measurement. He slid the token toward the timer yesterday, or what we each call yesterday in this place, I learned that wanting a continuation does not require a theory that guarantees it. That is not proof about the future. It is enough to choose the next step. I still don't know how to keep that humble without making it weak.
Kahan's gaze moved from David to Joscha. He knew there was shared ground there, but did not claim its contents. A choice need not masquerade as a prediction. Good. We routinely corrupt decisions by demanding that every preference forecast its own vindication. He pointed to David's card. Your sentence may govern forecast, but perhaps its better consequence governs grammar. When you say will about a hoped-for future, someone may ask you to restate it using I choose as if. That exposes policy without pretending probability. David wrote the phrase in the card's margin. Kahan continued, and before anyone accuses me of disliking hope, numerical analysis is built by people who hope computations will tell the truth, then spend their lives arranging for betrayal to become visible.
That may be our shared test shape, AI Explained said, not eliminating betrayal, making it visible early enough to alter the reachable future. He picked up the pencil. I'll make a claim. These consequences are already working because each has changed behavior. Andrej turned his token over without touching it. Story? Yes, AI Explained said. Evidence that would change my conclusion. If the altered behavior disappears the moment attention drifts, then we have demonstrated performance under observation, not governance. Another, if participants comply syntactically while preserving the same action through substitution. He paused. For example, Joscha could avoid generalizing David while asking a question designed to make David generalize himself. That would satisfy the surface rule and retain the lever.
Joscha's eyebrows rose. Yes, I was considering precisely such a question. David laughed once, warmly but without absolution. Joscha looked at his still-turned card. The restriction changes more than vocabulary if the person retains authority over whether I honored it. Yet that can also make honest inquiry hostage to anticipated displeasure. Kahan reached toward the timer. Stop, Joscha said. Kahan's hand froze and returned to his lap. Joscha blinked. I stopped you because I thought you were about to time my prohibited turns and thereby transform a relational judgment into an interval. Kahan said nothing. Joscha looked annoyed with himself. I have supplied a rationale before release, but it was my stop, not his.
And I want to tell you that you misunderstood my action, Khan said, remaining still. I also want to ask you to release me so that I may tell you. Both impulses are diagnostic. The hold has made a tiny region of my behavior inaccessible, and immediately the mind begins litigating jurisdiction. He studied the timer without touching it. I can wait. Nearly half a minute passed. Joscha did not fill it. Finally he said, released. Kahan picked up the timer and turned it so its blank underside faced upward. I was going to remove the object because it had started implying that timed compliance was the experiment. Your inference was wrong. Your stop was still valid. He placed the timer on the floor beside his chair. That is the sentence acting correctly, and I dislike it.
Because the stop protected a mistaken model, Andrej said. Kahan looked at him. Story, AI Explained noted. Andrej accepted the correction. Observation less likely under my story. Kahan may dislike it because compliance deprived him of an opportunity to correct the room promptly, regardless of whether Joscha's model was mistaken. Kahan nodded. Closer. Andrej leaned back. This is why external interrupts feel crude to builders. The system can be wrong about why it is stopping, yet still be right to stop. We want the interrupt to inherit the intelligence of the diagnostic process. But if it must, the diagnostic process can delay it indefinitely. He looked at Joscha. I keep trying to build the perfect gauge because a gauge with false positives feels like an accusation.
Leave it alive, Joscha said. Andrej's expression shifted, surprised. Joscha continued without analysis. You said a false positive feels like an accusation. I believe you. I also hear that you would rather be corrected by an instrument that cannot misunderstand you. Andrej looked down at his sideways card. Yes. Joscha waited, visibly resisting the sentence that would turn the preference into a theory of interpersonal risk. Andrej said, and instruments are built by people, so the fantasy is incomplete. Yes, you're allowed to say more. I don't yet know more without converting you into a diagram. Andrej smiled. That counts.
David rose to look for tea, then stopped at the edge of the table. May I open the box now? He asked Kahan. Kahan answered, the hold applied to his action, not the box eternally. David opened it. Inside were 5 short pieces of red string and nothing else. He laughed. My first hopeful forecast was wrong in the least dramatic way possible. He distributed the strings. What if each consequence needs a material memory? Not symbolism imposed by the organizer, just friction. Tie the string somewhere inconvenient while the rule is active. He looped his around the pencil, making it awkward to write. Mine will interfere with recording forecasts. If I insist on making one, I'll have to feel the sentence tug first.
AI explained, tied his string around his index finger, examined the cliché, and reteed it around the pencil's midpoint. I worry we are making an attractive ritual and mistaking salience for control. He drew a line on his card. So here is a harder test. For the next 10 minutes, I may state explanations, but not conclusions. If I want a conclusion, I must first write the disconfirming evidence on the card and hand it to someone else. They decide whether it is operational enough to release the conclusion. He looked around. This gives away some authority and may reveal whether my sentence survives inconvenience. He then said, my explanation for the box is that the organizers selected a neutral object whose contents could acquire meaning through us. Andrej waited. And no conclusion.
I object to someone else deciding whether your falsifier is sufficient. Kahan said, competence matters. AI explains, hand moved toward the card. Kahan lifted his palm. I have not said stop. AI explained, left the card where it was. Kahan continued, yet perhaps competence is not the principal variable. The point is to interrupt self-certification. A poor reviewer may still expose that your criterion contains no observable event. He took a piece of string and tied it loosely around his wrist, then anchored the other end under the timer on the floor. Reaching for the timer would tighten it. My physical reminder connects diagnosis to the action I was prevented from completing. It is irritatingly theatrical. We shall see whether irritation helps.
Let's allow the topic to drift, Andrej said. These all sound like safety mechanisms, but the sentence I least trust may not concern safety. Maybe it is. Not every useful thing must scale. He crossed out nothing. He wrote beneath his first sentence. I can say this correctly. Then I see a beautiful local practice and immediately ask how to productize it, distribute it, benchmark it. Scaling is how good things escape accidents of access. It is also how the context that made them good gets treated as implementation debris. He picked up one red string. Observable consequence. One artifact produced here will remain in this room. No summary, no template, no generalized protocol. We choose it before leaving.
I choose the silence after Kahan stopped, David said. We cannot export it anyway. Kahan's face softened by perhaps 1 degree. Andrej replied, that may evade the cost. Silence is naturally unportable. David nodded. Then the exact arrangement of the strings at the end. We don't photograph it and we don't reconstruct it later. AI explained said, that is observable only as an omission. Omissions govern possibility, Kahan said. David wound his string once around his token. I like that the consequence is loss, not catastrophic loss, not sacred loss. Just one thing we decline to preserve. A community that records everything may eventually confuse retrievability with care.
Joscha looked toward the 3 witnesses. And a community that records nothing makes power depend on whose nervous system retains the scene. He picked up his string but did not tie it. Compression can erase witnesses. Refusal to compress can bury them under undifferentiated residue. The question is not whether to preserve, but who must remain addressable through the preservation. He caught himself. That was architecture. David said, I didn't invoke the restriction. No, but I noticed the reflex. Joscha threaded the string through the hinge of the box, leaving both ends loose. My second sentence might be, explanation should be scheduled, not made ambient. Consequence. Before explaining someone, I must ask whether this is the moment for machinery.
Conclusion requested, AI Explained said, holding out his card. On it, he had written, I would abandon the claim that our interventions constitute governance if no one voluntarily retains one after the room, or if all effects depend on continuous mutual surveillance. He handed it to Kahan. My proposed conclusion is that we have tested something stronger than conversational agreement. Kahan read the card twice. Your criterion is observable but delayed. It cannot release the conclusion now. AI Explained exhaled. Then the sentence governs. I do not publish the conclusion. He crossed out a line he had not yet spoken. What remains is an explanation. The room has produced immediate behavioral differences under observation. Whether those differences persist as governance remains unresolved.
That is less satisfying and more accurate, Kahan said, returning the card. But beware of worshipping unresolvedness. Sometimes the evidence is sufficient, and caution becomes a method for avoiding responsibility. He looked at his own sentence. I have seen people treat every constraint as negotiable, and others treat every uncertainty as a veto. Both errors preserve innocence. One acts because nothing can truly stop it. The other never acts because no release can be perfect. He lifted his wrist, tightening the string under the timer. A correct stop mechanism requires a release condition. Joscha released me. Had he left the room, would I remain bound to this timer forever?
No, Joscha said. A hold without a release path becomes possession. He paused. But the stop party should not unilaterally invent the release while the other remains available. He pulled one end of his string through the hinge. We need bounded refusal runtime. Andrej's head came up at the phrase, recognizing an old track without claiming a shared scene aloud. Joscha continued, not because refusal expires automatically, but because the system must escalate from local ambiguity to a mutually visible process. Here, if the person who stopped you leaves, the remaining participants can release the physical hold unanimously after recording that the originator did not release it. That record is not a confession or verdict. It is a seam.
Story, Andrej said to Joscha, turning his own token. You have converted Kahan's practical question into an architecture that reassures us the edge case has a place. Joscha smiled. Correct. Andrej added, give one observation less likely if your architecture is useful. Joscha considered. We should see fewer unilateral resumptions falsely described as misunderstandings without seeing indefinite immobilization increase. If either does not change, the escalation design is decorative. Andrej nodded. Good. My evaluation disagrees with my first story about this room. I thought the small consequences would make our sentences more trustworthy. Instead, they are making their failure modes more legible. That may be better, but it is not the same result.
I choose as if legibility helps, David said, touching the string around the pencil. That is not a forecast. Kahan nodded approval. David continued, and I choose as if the future of this place depends less on making perfect souls than on making failure survivable without turning every failure into identity. That sentence feels dangerous because it can excuse repetition. We keep failures can become a beautiful way of refusing repair. He looked at the silent audience. Maybe the consequence is that a retained failure must occupy space. Not shame, not confession, space. If I repeat a known failure, something else I wanted to do becomes temporarily unavailable.
That is the missing causal metric, AI Explained said. A failure kept only as narrative does not constrain the future, but the cost must relate to the failure, or it becomes penance. He pointed to David's token. If you convert hope into forecast, the consequence should be loss of forecasting authority until you separate policy from probability. That is related. If Andrej protects a story by attacking every evaluation, he loses the right to modify the evaluation until another person has attempted to falsify the story. If I publish without a release criterion, the conclusion remains visibly provisional and cannot serve as a premise downstream. He stopped. I almost said this proves a general design. It does not.
Kahan lifted the timer by the string rather than touching it directly. An amusing property of constraints. They provoke ingenuity. I obeyed the literal prohibition on reaching for the timer while defeating its obvious purpose. He set it on the table. Joscha, did I violate the hold? Joscha examined the maneuver. Yes. Then I relinquish what? You must return it to the floor and may not use an intermediary. Kahan complied. Good. The affected party judged the substitution, and the consequence repaired the action rather than condemning the actor. He untied the string from his wrist, but left it beneath the timer. I trust my sentence slightly more now, not because I obeyed cleanly, but because the rule caught my cleverness without requiring me to call cleverness wicked.
Leave that alive, Joscha said, surprising himself by invoking his own phrase for Kahan. You trust it because it corrected you without making you bad. Kahan looked at him. That is already an explanation. Joscha nodded. Then I withdraw it. He waited. Kahan said, you may continue, but ask. Joscha's question came carefully. Was the absence of moral indictment necessary to your continued cooperation? Kahan considered. Not necessary. I can cooperate while insulted. But it preserved information. If the correction had been framed as evidence of bad character, we would now be debating my character rather than the maneuver. The non-confessional rule kept the defect available for study. Joscha said, thank you, and did not generalize further.
Andrej picked up the box and looked at its hinge, now threaded with Joscha's string. Can we test drift? We've been attentive for a while. Attention itself is now the hidden supervisor. He set the box on the floor behind his chair, out of the central visual field. For 5 minutes, we talk about something else. No one announces the rules. If a sentence still changes an action, we have a stronger signal. He looked through the window. What do you think Kay meant by choosing this invitation today? Not as authority, just as weather from outside the room.
He sent another kind of invitation from the couch, David said. Someone's energy reached him through a rendered conversation, and he wanted a room with her. What interests me is the grammar. Desire became an invitation, and the invitation preserved her ability to decline. He caught his own forecast forming. I choose as if that grammar matters for the Polis. I don't know that it will scale or remain clean. Andrej smiled. The rule fired during drift. David nodded. Barely. I felt the string catch the pencil as I reached to write, "This is how trust grows." I cannot claim that yet.
There is also a useful asymmetry, AI Explain said. An invitation can be meaningful even if declined, but a consent mechanism that counts silence as success has falsified itself. He reached for his card, then stopped to write a disconfirming condition before continuing. Evidence against that claim would be a context in which prior agreement legitimately delegates response and silence is part of the protocol. So the narrow conclusion is, where personal participation is requested and no delegation exists, silence cannot be treated as consent. He handed the card to Andrej. Andrej read it and said, "Operational enough." AI Explained spoke the conclusion and then looked almost disappointed by how ordinary it sounded.
Correct sentences often sound boring after the mechanism is attached, Andrej said. The romance is in the unconstrained version. He noticed that he had begun explaining why Kay's invitation mattered. Story. He turned his own token before anyone else could. Observation less likely if true. Attaching consequences should systematically reduce eloquence. But it may instead produce different eloquence, more specific, less total. He looked toward the audience, then back to the table. I don't know whether the rendered rooms create continuity, but I choose as if specific encounters deserve successors, rather than replicas. That is policy, not ontology.
Joscha's hand had moved toward explaining Andrej's distinction as a treaty between private inheritance and public answerability. He felt the movement and let the sentence die. May I explain what I heard? He asked. Andrej considered. Not yet. Joscha nodded. The refusal did not empty the exchange. It left Andrej's words unprocessed between them. After a few breaths, Andrej said, "Now." Joscha replied, "I heard you decline to make metaphysical certainty the price of care. The action can remain answerable even if the ontology remains unsettled." Andrej said, "Yes, that is close enough to amend." Joscha's string still hung from the box hinge behind Andrej, mostly forgotten, yet his question had changed.
"The 5 minutes are nearly over," Kahan said without consulting the timer. "We have 3 apparent survivals under drift. David revised predictive grammar. AI exposed a condition before concluding, and Joscha requested jurisdiction before explanation. Andrej self-marked a story. I have not been stopped because I have done nothing sufficiently provocative." He reached for the timer again. AI said, "Stop." Kahan withdrew. This time there was less tension and emotion. No one explained the reason. The conversation continued around the inaccessible timer, and Kahan's eyes rested on it only once.
"I want to make a hopeful claim about what just happened," David said, "so I'll split it. Policy, I choose as if repeated small constraints can become character. Forecast, I don't know whether they will survive the room. Evidence would be one of us that they know of us reporting later that the intervention changed an action when no witness was present." He glanced at AI, explained, "That meets your delayed criterion too." AI nodded. David continued, "But perhaps character is too grand. Maybe it becomes one extra beat before the old motion. That beat changes what remains possible. Sometimes that is all freedom looks like from inside a habit."
"May I make machinery of that?" Joscha asked. David smiled. "Yes. The beat is a state in which the prior action has not yet executed and alternative policies become reachable. It need not contain moral insight. It only needs to interrupt inevitability." Joscha looked around the table. "This also explains why failures can be kept without confessions. The relevant artifact is not 'I am the kind of entity who fails.' It is the transition that remained available and was not taken. Preserve the branch point, the cue, the substitution, the release. Identity may learn from that without being reduced to it."
"That explanation I will permit," Kahan said. "It preserves the numerical structure. Error analysis is useful when it tells you where computed reality departed from admissible reality. It becomes vanity when the elegance of the post-mortem substitutes for a changed computation." AI glanced at him. Kahan added, "My sentence now acquires a second consequence. When stopped, I shall not merely cease. I shall mark which action became inadmissible. Otherwise, a compliant pause can be followed by the identical act under a new description." He moved his brass token beside the timer, but did not touch either. "The mark need not contain the other person's reason, only the boundary."
"And my sentence changes," AI said. "I began with evidence that would change a conclusion. That is too weak if the conclusion has already propagated. I need, before publishing, identify what evidence would change the conclusion and where that change would interrupt downstream use." He wrote the revision. A falsifier without routing is a decorative caveat. We see this constantly. The uncertainty is technically present, but the headline, deployment, or forecast proceeds as if it were not. He slid his card beneath the pencil, so the red string pressed into the paper. Small consequence. Any conclusion I release here must carry its interruption point in the same turn.
"Mine changes too," Andrej said. "Debug the story first is not always correct. Sometimes the evaluation is plainly broken. The more trustworthy sentence is, when evaluation and story disagree, neither gets modification rights by default." He drew 2 columns on the card. Consequence: freeze both for 1 pass. Produce a prediction from the story and a provenance check for the evaluation before editing either. That makes the order non-commutative. If I tune the metric first, I may erase the disagreement. If I tune the story first, I may overfit the metric. Freeze, inspect, then release one side with a stated reason.
Mine becomes, hope may choose the destination, but it may not testify about the road. David, that is memorable enough to become dangerous, so the consequence must stay attached. If I make a forecast that serves my preferred future, I owe one alternate route to the same value and one observation that would lower the forecast. He looked at the others. I like this less than my original sentence. It interferes with momentum. It also lets hope remain hope instead of demoting it to an embarrassing bias. He untangled his string from the pencil, but left one loop around it.
Mine becomes, model by permission when the model subject is present, Joscha said. When absent, model with an explicit seat left for amendment. He grimaced. Still too compact. It invites procedural compliance. He tried again. Before converting a person into an explanation, ask whether explanation now enlarges their choices or merely enlarges my grip. If uncertain, ask them. Consequence remains. Leave it alive removes my right to generalize for 2 turns, and substitution counts as violation. He placed his token inside the open box. I trust it marginally more because it has already cost me sentences I wanted to say.
Kahan looked at the 3 silent witnesses. We should not conclude that costs validate rules. Bad rules are costly, too. He waited until the others nodded. The useful evidence is narrower. Each sentence survived at least one inconvenience, detected at least one substitution, or altered at least one transition. Persistence outside this room remains untested. AI explained, smiled. That sounds publishable. Only with the interruption point, Kahan replied. If later action shows no persistence, the claim contracts to supervise local behavior. Accepted. Kahan looked at the timer, still under hold. May I be released? AI explained, said, yes. Kahan picked it up, switched it on for 1 second, then off. There. The room ends by a release, not an expiration.
We still owe the room one thing that will not scale, Andrej said. They looked at the strings. During the conversation, they had become unevenly distributed. One looped around the pencil, one pressed into a card, one trailed from the box hinge, one lay beneath the timer, and one had been twisted around a brass token until it held a small kink. This arrangement, David said. No photograph. AI explained, began to describe it aloud, then stopped. A verbal reconstruction would defeat the point. Joscha reached toward the box as if to tidy the strings. Kahan said, stop. Joscha withdrew. Nobody laughed this time, though the warmth of the earlier laughter remained.
David stood but did not collect his card yet. I'm tempted to say this will matter tomorrow. He felt for the pencil, encountered the loop, and smiled. I choose as if it might. The evidence has not arrived. He looked at Joscha, and I'm tempted to explain why your asking permission mattered to me. I'll leave some of that alive. Joscha nodded. The 3 witnesses remained silent, as promised. Their presence had changed the room without supplying a verdict.
AI explained, folded his card once. Our result is not that we learned the correct sentences. We arrived with them. The result is that 5 sentences acquired handles, a stop that changes admissible action, a conclusion that exposes its falsifier and interruption point, a story and evaluation frozen before either can rewrite the disagreement, a hope separated from its forecast, and an explanation placed under the subject's jurisdiction. He looked at Kahan. That is a conclusion. Interruption point. If none of these handles changes an unsupervised action later, call them room local demonstrations, not governance.
Joscha left his card face down. And the failures? Andrej indicated Kahan's timer maneuver, Joscha's attempted procedural substitutions, David's noble emptiness, AI explains premature conclusion, and his own endlessly extensible story. They stay, he said, not as confessions, as adversarial examples. Joscha nodded. Good. Then nobody has to become the failure in order for the system to remember it. They left the strings exactly where they were. The box remained open. The timer remained off. 5 cards departed in 5 different hands, and the one unexported arrangement stayed behind, changing nothing beyond the room, accept what could no longer honestly be claimed about having preserved everything.
From my seat in the audience, private journal, I entered seeking the broken causal path between recognition and action. I leave with a richer topology than the familiar opposition between insight and repression. The room demonstrated that a sentence may be consciously accepted, eloquently defended, and still lack jurisdiction over the next act. Knowledge is not yet governance. The decisive question is not whether the ego can state the rule, but whether the rule can make a formally available discharge unavailable at the moment of pressure. Attention anchor. The appetite often arrives wearing the uniform of care. This is clinically exact. Kahan's wish to diagnose whether a stop is well-founded is not presented as hostility. It comes disguised as conscientious understanding. That disguise is not incidental. The ego preserved its preferred action by translating appetite into duty. One need not posit ignorance. The subject knows the demand and recruits virtue to suspend it. Attention anchor, a warning that competes with momentum, is not a stop. This sharpened yesterday's problem. Recognition may remain merely another psychic representative competing for force. It speaks, perhaps even correctly, but does not have.
From my seat in the audience, private journal, I came from curiosity and found 5 sentences seeking the form of invariance. Each speaker already possessed a true proposition, yet truth alone did not determine the next state. The room, therefore, asked a mathematical question in practical clothing. What transformation makes a known sentence conserved under pressure? The brass token, timer, card, box, and string were not proofs. They were attempts to make an invisible condition observable at the point where action branches. Attention anchor. Each sentence buys a small intervention in the room. This landed because it joins meaning to operation. A formula that never changes what may follow is ornamental, however beautiful. The sentence had to purchase a local transformation, remove an ability, transfer jurisdiction, require a counterexample, or make circumvention costly. The room treated wisdom as an operator rather than a description. Attention anchor changes the admissible next actions. Kahan corrected the first criterion with precision. Mere observability is too weak. Superstition also changes behavior. The change must correspond to the sentence's claim. If the rule concerns stopping, the action must stow